What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host for today, Van Jackson. I have an amazing guest today who I've tried to get on the pod for a while. He had a book come out, what was it, a year or two ago? Called
last year, yeah.
Yeah. Endgame, Economic Nationalism and Global Decline. I read it as a compliment to my book, The Rivalry Peril, actually, in a way. I'd say there's like 5 thinkers who are alive right now that I find very stimulating. This guy is one of them. Jamie Merchant, how you doing, man?
Very good. It's good to finally meet. And similarly, I've long followed your work and big fan. And so, yeah, I agree. We have a lot in common. And I'm just happy. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, appreciate that. I wonder if you could introduce yourself a bit to the audience, like whatever you want to tell people about what you do, where you're coming from with all of this. Your work all seems to kind of knit together, almost like a larger project in a way.
All of my work sort of flows out of a long-standing commitment to working class internationalism. Let's just call it that.
Mm-hmm.
That really became like a driving force for me during the 2010s and during the Bernie Sanders run. The first Bernie Sanders run, actually, there was all this excitement around that campaign, and it was this, socialism was being mainstreamed in this country in a way it hasn't been in many decades. But there was still a very strong, like, sort of nationalist, social democratic, like old school social democratic nationalism to what he was saying in those years, and it just really, it was one of the main things that kind of clashed with me.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just, full disclosure, come out of like a kind of Marxist background intellectually and politically. And so I started to sort of argue against that position in a number of essays that I published during that time. And that then culminated in the book that you mentioned with the field note series of the Brooklyn Rail. And then just since then, it's just been informing pretty much my whole take on like political economy and the politics of the critique of political economy. But really, a lot of it boils down to that commitment to internationalism.
Yeah, I think one of the things where we converge in a way that makes us quite antagonistic to people with power is that we've been critics from the jump of what has turned out to be economic nationalism. This reversion. Reversion is not the right word, but like capitalists relying on the state basically to continue securing the bag for themselves, and nobody else matters. I mean, that's basically that. There was a crude essence of that in what everybody else was basically calling Bidenomics.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I had to burn a lot of bridges as part of calling that out. But you had a piece in the Brooklyn Rail that was kind of like triggering for me, and that just came out. I think what I found so generative. That's mostly what we're going to talk about today. But I'm happy to go wherever we want to go. I found very generative this piece, or I was reading it as a critique that said, stop thinking like a policymaker, which is ironic for some of the listeners of this show. But like the policymaker way of thinking about state power is like, it's a mode of politics that doesn't match our moment of decay and crisis and everything that we see in the headlines. What is the core argument that you're trying to make here? Or like where did this piece even come from? Because you're synthesizing everything that people are familiar with in the fire hose of bullshit that's like going on in the world and going on with MAGA in America. But then you're like situating it and offering an account of it all in a totalizing way. And like, that's what it restores sanity, but in a way that's like has very grim prognostications. So what's the argument here, and where does this piece come from for you?
I agree with your like description of that essay as kind of like delimiting the policy space as like a particular object or a field that it may be less useful to take seriously in some respects than it used to be. And that, I think that's really that the desire to want to kind of really dig that out and get at this like weird feeling where, we have what is now clearly some kind of quasi or neo-fascist reactionary project, to put it mildly, that has not only one state power, but is actively, dismantling what the parts of the state that they don't want, that they don't like, that they see as allied with the enemy, and building the repressive parts of out the repressive sections of the state out in this like really gargantuan and monstrous way. And furthermore, doing that by continuing to enrich all of the most like evil ghouls of the capitalist and financial class that ruled this country, and that are kind of in constant like war and allyship with the Trump administration, depending on what day it is and who you ask. But that's the project, right? And it just like there was this dissonance between the reality of what's happening in the American state and what's happening to American capitalism at that large macro level, and continue the idea that we can continue to talk about policy, good and bad policy, and smart and progressive policy the way that we had in like years past, as if nothing had really changed.
Mm-hmm.
And that like, if a Democrat wins in 2028, we can just get back to business of like trying to pass progressive policies and like kind of like get the Bernie, some semblance of like the Bernie agenda going, right? And it was, I think, the feeling that there's not a way that we're going back to the status quo ante here. That was like the sense that I guess spurred me to want to write about it and to try to outline the space for maybe a different kind of politics.
It's so hard because you're writing something, you're offering a profound critique of our moment, basically. And it's the kind of critique that can become the foundation. You just said a version of this. Like, it can become the foundation for a different kind of politics. And that will find expression in policy. Like, there will be different policies that align with a different kind of politics. But policy is not how you do politics in this kind of conjuncture, in this kind of fucking situation that we find ourselves in. Total fucking mismatch. That's very challenging, not just to how I'm kind of like predisposed to how I was trained or whatever, but like I think that's impossibly challenging to the lanyard class. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like the technocratic professionals with a Ivy League master's degree who go become public servants and or management consultants and or fucking white collar servants of Goldman Sachs oligarchs or whatever. Part of the challenge of it is like it's almost like a meta critique, like it goes too deep for us to like automatically know what is to be done about it, or unless you have thoughts about what's the roadmap here. I don't know.
It does. That was the intention, was to go deep. I don't have any cook shops I'm not outlining the cook shop of the future, and I don't have the blueprints or anything. Certainly, I do have thoughts about like a political way forward or a way to think about politics in this moment, but which I'm happy for us to get into. But do you want to do that now, or maybe a little later?
Let's shove it for now.
Yeah.
There's beats in the piece that you kind of walk through that are worth both like introducing or maybe like amplifying further. Like you set up the whole thing because you're kind of arguing that like you call it the progressive managerial state. So the modern state form, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's dying, or it's becoming something very different from how we idealize it. The technocrats will save us, or they will design our social order that produces democracy and equality for ourselves or something. And like, that's why state power is good, because it can be used for those purposes. And that has nothing to do with the actually existing modern state. And that's becoming more and more obvious under Trump. But I mean, that was also the delusion of the Biden years. So you're describing that decay, which I think is a really important reorientation of how we think about the state. Almost like we need greater cynicism when we look at the state, is one way to put that. But you're framing all of this in terms of like some things that are going on now, like tariffs, right? There's like Trump has this tariff fetish, he's applying it here and there and everywhere. Why? Why? You walk through a bunch of different rationales that people offer to make sense of the tariff regime, but they're not all compatible. They can't possibly, they don't all, like, it doesn't make sense to put forward all these explanations.
Yeah, I mean, the tariff regime that's another one that you'll get a different response about depending on who you ask and what day you ask them for what its purpose is and what it's supposed to be doing. Getting back to kind of the general thrust of your question, the fuel in the engine of this larger state transformation that we're seeing now from the previous, what really, in the essay I described as the 20th, the political legacy of the 20th century in the form of this progressive managerial state. And its evolution into now this new, much more monstrous and brutal and repressive apparatus under Trump too is being fueled by this broader international slowdown in economic growth that isn't just limited to the United States, but is obviously affecting the United States very acutely, since it is still, for better or worse, really, really for the worse these days, the linchpin of the global of the international capitalist order. And in the piece I go through the different charts. You can look at all these different data sources, and you can look at the rate of global GDP growth per capita. You can look at labor productivity. You can look at a variety of different rates of investment. You can sort of go down the list, and all of them tell a similar tale of a line that's going through cycles. Kind of like this, but each peak is lower than the one before. And over years it just gradually trends downward, slowly but surely. States, governments, national governments have a variety of different tools that they desperately are trying to use to fix that. The huge growth in public and commercial debt is one aspect of that I sort of get into in the piece. But as you mentioned, the tariffs is another. The tariff regime is the first thing you have to remember about it is it's been an idée fixe of Trump since the 80s. You probably know, he's been, there's TV footage of him talking about this shit from the 80s, back when Japan was the national boogeyman, right? That was going to overtake the United States and destroy us economically or whatever. And he was arguing for it then. And it's just always been there and lodged in his lizard brain. Now he's in a position where the kind of broader MAGA coalition that he represents and all the different kind of goons that he's surrounded himself with are of a similar hyper nationalist cast of mind, and are convinced on this tariff thing for a variety of reasons. They think it can they think it's a way to, some of them think it's a way to revive the sort of old masculine white working class, as we supposedly reshore industries, as people try to get around, the investors try to get around the tariffs. It's a way to raise labor productivity, supposedly. It's a way to, through that increased productivity, hopefully increase exports and growth through trade and chip away at the national debt, maybe, right? You won't need to rely so much on the national debt to fund the government. And then lastly, additionally, it's a way to just threaten everyone else, coerce everyone else internationally to do whatever the regime wants. And if they don't fall in line, then, the tariffs are a weapon for that. So, but as you said, it's internally contradictory. It's to revive manufacturing, which they supposedly want to do, for the tariffs to work for that, you need a lower exchange rate, right? So the currency is cheaper and the exports are cheaper, and you can be competitive internationally. But they also insist on having the dollar continue to be the global reserve currency, and that if the currency is a global reserve currency, it has to be, it has to be at a rate of value a good deal higher than most other currencies most of the time, or at least in parity. And so those two things are in conflict with each other. But I could get into more detail about how they think they can get around that contradiction. But
actually, I was about to ask that, like, because the MAGA intellectuals have they've insisted on dollar primacy. They've described the world as multipolar, and then they've insisted on this fantasy of reindustrialization, strengthen the white male breadwinner kind of shit. You were talking about how like those things are in tension, but what is the way out? Like if you're a national conservative, you have these planks or these platforms, and like logically they don't really mesh together, or you're going to have to trade off these things. How do they sort of try to reconcile that? Like what's the way through?
Mm-hmm. I mean, they think that the main figure here is this guy, Stephen Moran. I don't know if you know of him, but he's one of the main trade policy guys in the Trump administration. In fact, he was just confirmed for one of the Fed board positions on the Fed board of governors.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's great. We love that. But he thinks that, and he passed around a memo that got a lot of like attention towards the end of last year on this.
Like, I mean, he remaking the global financial system or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Like a primer or like a user's guide or something like that to remake the international order, something like that. And his idea is basically that we can have a depreciated currency and have it continue to be the reserve currency by just finding ways to force our allies to continue to buy our debt and to continue to use it as the global reserve currency. And they can do that by threatening to withdraw military aid to our supposed allies and friends abroad. They can threaten additional tariffs. But basically that's the strategy, is like, look, you will continue to let the dollar be the reserve currency, even if we depreciate it for our manufacturing interests. Because if you don't, we're going to hit you on these other scores. And they had these ideas like they're going to get people to buy like 100-year treasury bonds, or even like indefinite treasury bonds, like bonds in perpetuity that they just we just pay interest forever and never have to pay the principal. They have a variety of kind of what I think are very unlikely ideas to pan out. But the threats, they can definitely try to leverage those. And that's their plan, is just like, we're just going to use force to bridge this conflict between these different like goals.
It's interesting because like this sounds like the idea that you're going to extort and coerce your friends abroad into continuing to use your decaying currency as the backstop. That's what the Plaza Accords was kind of in 1985, right? This is like the technically it was a multilateral meeting or whatever, but it was basically America and its white friends ganging up on Japan to make Japan depreciate or appreciate its currency, which is relative depreciation for the US. And and it it was strong arming and it worked. And I've watched a generation of like Asia hands and Japan hands, to the extent they even know anything about the Plaza Accords, they don't think of it any type of way. Like they don't think of it as like, we fucked our client state in the ass, basically helped produce their decades of economic malaise.
Yeah, for real. I mean, there's definitely a case to be made that those policies are connected, and like the end of the Japanese property bubble at the end of the 80s is a complex story, but I think it is related though to what happened with the Accord and how the Japanese economy was affected by it. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like they're trying to take that strategy, but like really amp it up and just project it internationally to like all of our trade partners, is like one way of reading that.
Yeah. There's it's like a template. It's funny because in the 80s, which is where Trump's mind seems to exist, the Plaza Accords was this like major object, like it was this big thing that happened. And it relates to Japan, the Yellow Peril, which was obviously also big in Trump's mind. And then it's interesting to then see Trump basically trying to do Plaza Accord on steroids, When I'm trying to like make sense of MAGA and US state power shit for like media and stuff, I usually frame the MAGA coalition as like roughly ethno-nationalists and oligarchs because there are these like competing power centers. But that's like a little, I mean, I think it's correct, but I think it's also crude. And that oligarch category has a lot going on in it. One of the things you do in the piece is like, I mean, you're talking about class struggle, obviously, between workers and owners of capital, but you also talk about a capital struggle. Like, what does that look like?
I mean, my basic like sort of definition of the like what we would call the capitalist state, right? The state formation we live under is that it's in a constant kind of battle with like trying to organize and ally with like different fractions of a capitalist class that's like itself constantly at war with each other, right? And constantly like with shifting alliances and attempts to destroy each other and just all that competitive the competitive conflict of capitalism. I mean, like the kind of landscape of the MAGA right is. Are you in the U.S. by the way, or are you abroad?
I'm in New Zealand.
You're abroad, right?
Yeah,
you're in New Zealand. Yeah. Okay. Man, this shit must look so wild from outside the country. It's like one quick and dirty way of kind of like mapping it out. Maybe just like elaborate a little bit on what you said is like you have the traditional kind of like Republican like business conservatives, a lot of whom are in finance, a lot of whom are in fossil fuels, like a lot of whom are or some of whom are in healthcare, some sections of healthcare. Like security, transportation, like border security and defense, right? To some degree, defense is also heavily Democratic, though, actually. But that's like kind of like part of the traditional, like Republican business coalition. And of course, the new faction, obviously, that came in most recently in this most recent struggle is like the tech right. And the radicalization of Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen and similar like kind of Silicon Valley affiliated cretins and billionaires who, for a variety of reasons that we could get into, but like that's kind of a complex story in its own, decided to throw in their lot with Trump last year, like towards like the second half of the Biden administration, and thought that he was going to help them out on all their dumb shit, like crypto, like AI, whatever, like Meta's next stupid thing is, like their goggle or their new glasses they're trying to promote. It's like they felt like, for a variety of reasons, they felt like their whole business model was on the ropes. Not just those guys, but a lot of like influential startups, like especially in like military and defense, like Anduril, Palantir, right? Which have now become much more well-known names than a few years ago even. There was a strong desire on their part to want to get plugged into the military-industrial complex and the defense budget, right? Which historically has been dominated by, the big names like Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop and, the big legacy contractors.
Call it the war budget.
Trump is like,
you call it defense.
What's that?
You said defense budget. We call it the war
Department
budget.
of War. The war budget, Department of War. Yeah. And they were right. Trump has totally been like his government has been helping them break into the Department of War budget, further just decreasing the need for them to be competitive or innovative or anything like that, because they can just hoover up profits from the defense budget. And so it really was this like sort of crazy like coalition emerging from the weird tech world that has that put a lot of wind in the sails of the Trump 2 or the MAGA 2 coalition. And there's still a lot of conflict between them and the I mean, to put it lightly, between them and like the traditional, like sort of business conservative faction and like the Wall Street faction of the party. But so far, they've managed to sort of hold it together, even though, Elon and Trump had their big falling out a few months ago, which is really hilarious to watch. And then there's also, I mean, I could go on, like in the piece I get into how there's like, this new asset management capitalism paradigm that emerged and the tech rights kind of relationship to that. But I'll stop there for a second.
Yeah. No, I mean, one of the reasons why I find it like necessary but insufficient to kind of like know your enemy and study MAGA, to like obsess about specifically the evil stupidity of this motley coalition, is the counterfactual of like, if Kamala had won, if the Democrats had power right now, Anduril and Palantir and fucking OpenAI and all of the oligarchs of the tech right would still be securing the bag by allying with the state. These guys were going to get paid either way. They saw maybe there's an ideological affinity that attracts them to MAGA, but like they also see an opportunity to have a greater, share of political influence or whatever with the right than with the Democrats. But like they were like this path that we're going down where you have the fusion of, surplus capital with the national security state. That's overdetermined. I mean, that's happening no matter who wins, And so that forces, I mean, logically, I'm thinking through this, that means necessarily we cannot diagnose the ills of the moment as simply a function of like MAGA's evil decision making. Like we have to look at bigger structural forces. We have to contemplate the possibility that like a totalizing theory or a totalizing account of our world is, valid, plausible, necessary, etc. And that's what you are sort of gesturing at. In fact, you critique Adam Tooze. Adam Tooze, whom, I like. I mean, I respect the guy a lot, but you make some very valid critiques of Tooze. I think that are totally fair. And so, like, I wonder if we could talk about some of the intellectual sources of the idealized thinking of the modern state. You lead off. Actually, maybe the first place to start here is like trade wars are class wars. This fucking 2020 book, which has its own political life separate from even its analysis, but its analysis is also kind of hit and miss. And in fact, in The Rivalry Peril, the book I wrote with Mike Brennes, we cite the shit out of that book as part of like building a theory about China, but we're doing it in a kind of immanent critique kind of way. Like we're not doing it because we think Klein and Pettis are valid in what they're saying and trade wars are class wars. It's because like we know trade wars are class wars is a like language that the technocratic class responds to. And so if we can build a theory of China that is like subversive out of their source material, then it should be undeniable. I mean, that was sort of like the reasoning that we were doing.
Yeah.
But so trade wars are class wars. What's the thing there?
I mean, I think I get into it in my Endgame book too. That book, because already a few years, like when I was writing that book was quite influential. But it's a very influential book. Like Matt Klein and especially Pettis, the two co-authors. I know their ideas are taken very seriously in policy circles. Like my understanding is that the Biden people, really latched on to that argument.
Off to it, yeah. Sorry,
fantasized about it. Yeah. No, for real. I mean, and then I mean, in Endgame, I talked about it. Like, I mean, this book basically just it provides a theoretical rationale for the Trumpian like kind of victimization narrative, right? About like the U.S. economy and like how we got here and the macroeconomics of it. And sure enough, it became the kind of part of the policy Bible of the current like policy class in this country because the Biden people love it. And I think the Trump 2 people definitely. I'm fairly certain they don't have many problems with the analysis, because the analysis, as you probably know, basically points the finger, like all the ills of the international regime, and by extension of the international economic regime, we should say, and by extension the American economy within that regime, are due to the tremendous savings glut, right, built up by excess reliance on exports in a few countries, including Germany, but of course especially China. The argument is really about China and about the export-led path to development that country took over the last several decades. And so their basic idea that created a huge sort of savings glut in China, which then the national political leadership was not interested in redistributing to the broader population, meant that they were going to recycle it internationally, mainly into U.S. Treasury bonds, into basically forms of investment that contribute to the financialization and inequality in the U.S. economy, right? By just pumping those surplus savings into the American economy, and that in turn, right? Supposedly, the argument goes, like, feeds out of control, like, credit growth within the American economy, and feeds this whole loop. And then credit growth means that consumers can buy more products from China. And then, so that's like the whole, kind of loop that they're trying to point out in that book. But, it's very appealing if you're a policymaker in this country, because like it just gives you like an enemy to basically blame most of the country's major economic problems on, and now political problems. And, it's because of this wrongheaded trade policy that the sort of national enemy has been pursuing. And so, everything, the onus is basically just on China, right? Like the U.S. national debt and like the insane deficit spending of this country, right, doesn't have anything to do with like the bloated, military and war budget. Like, it doesn't have anything to do with like corporate tax policy. Doesn't have anything to do with like, the ludicrous subsidies that the state, gives to the private sector, to corporations, like all the time with every budget.
It's just Chinese overcapacity, man. That's all it is.
It's like that. So that's why. So that's its bipartisan appeal. You don't have to think about any of these. You don't have to think about the inconvenient fact that, like, manufacturing output as a percentage of GDP is going down almost for everyone across the board.
It predates China becoming a manufacturing powerhouse too.
Yeah. And now it's affecting China, right? Like, deindustrialization is a thing that is happening in China as well. But you don't have to think any of these complex questions. It's just like, okay, overcapacity, done. That's the problem. Yeah. And so I think it's ultimately it ended up having quite a pernicious impact, in the way that it's serving, like, as a rationale for some of these trade policies, in a way that I don't know if even the authors intended when they first published it, but maybe so. I don't really know what their intentions were, but in any case, that's the kind of role it's played, and it's really become kind of like the policy common sense in the U.S. state.
Yeah. I watched something like similar happen with the Jake Sullivan crowd leading up to 2020, where they were casting about for like a Democratic Party foreign policy that could distinguish themselves from the Trump administration, which they had tremendous similarities with, but it was a moment where like it was popular to heap nothing but critiques on Trump, foreign policy and stuff. And so they circled around for reasons of convenience, of opportunism, to the language of like the China shock. And so it's like, oh, the Rust Belt gets deindustrialized, and that's something that China did to us. And it's like, there's so much distortion in that statement, but it becomes like this intellectual lodestar for what becomes great power competition, and that's the basis on which we get the $1 trillion fucking war machine. And that is the power matrix that like fucking Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and Anduril and Palantir, like that's what they're plugging into. And that's a big section that is like comprising what MAGA is and helps them propel to power, Peter
Yeah.
Thiel, who funds JD Vance. JD Vance becomes vice president because of this shit. And it's like, it's just, it makes me feel like almost like a psycho conspiracy theorist with the red yarn across the picture, with all the pictures, and it's all connected because it
Yeah.
actually fucking is. You know?
It is. It is. Yeah,
Um,
there's every conspiracy theory has a rational basis.
Fuck, man. Yes, and the key is to like constantly. This is the job of the public intellectual in this moment. I feel like is like give voice to this stuff and explain it in ways that are like manageable or consumable without sounding like a raving fucking lunatic.
Yeah.
because everything is so absurd now. Okay, so that's Klein and Pettis, Trade Wars or Class Wars.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I thought that they were trying to do with that book that got totally lost. I don't know what you think about this. I thought they were trying to do the John Hobson version theory of imperialism, basically.
They definitely were. Yeah.
Which is like basically you have imperialism is the result of domestic inequality. And China has domestic inequality, so like watch out, they're gonna become imperialist, and in a way they kind of already are, in a way we are kind of already are, but like I thought that was like that's an argument worth making kind of thing, but that kind of fell out totally. And if it's true for China, it has to be true for America, and you can't have that.
Yeah. I mean, I think they try to get around that sort of, or I don't know, maybe not get around it is the right way to describe it, but it's like the classic Hobson argument, is like, demand is too low in the domestic market for your exports, and so the industrial surplus has to find external markets. You have to subjugate external markets for your to become sinks for your exports, essentially, right? And that's imperialism for Hobson, basically. And they were like, yeah, the book is like, so China is doing a Hobson to America, but there was no willingness to see any kind of reciprocal dynamic involved, nor to see any agency of like U.S. capitalists playing a major role in like forging these connections between the two countries, and how it was. It was a business calculation. Like they made all these decisions. Like,
view of everything, like flag brain, like it's wild.
Yeah.
It's wild how you can analyze a global system of relations in terms of like what one country is doing. Like the whole point is it's relational,
Yes.
Okay, so Klein and Pettis. What about the Adam Tooze stuff? What's your critique there? I mean, and it has something to do with like who his intellectual reference points are a little bit, I think.
Yeah. So I mean, Tooze has had a running commentary on Trump too, all throughout this year in his chart books, and for months, he's making the argument that look, we want to say that this is like MAGA, or we want to say that Trump is a version of this, or it's like they're trying to do like this kind of policy, or it's something out of the old fascist playbook from the 20th century, or people are reaching for these explanations, but he's like, this is so radically different that like we don't have a vocabulary to adequately describe it, because it's so blatantly griftery and just like venal, that we don't have the language to really adequately capture what's happening, and things are transforming so quickly. He was sort of just doing his usual, like, we're in medias res, right? Like we can't subsume this under any sort of macro concepts because it's so radically different. But then he had a piece a chart book essay that he published where he was like, well, in fact, actually, what we see with the Trump administration's kind of flippant attitude towards laws and the legal system is an example of what he calls modern power, right? Like it's just like the way that like modernity, like state power and modernity works is through all these intricate connections between between the legal system and the economy and, illegal activity. And he was trying to, he himself was searching for like a macro concept to like kind of label the whole assemblage with. And, one of his main influences there is Foucault, which also is a big influence for me incidentally as well. But so I just thought that was kind of ironic, like he after flying the flag of like, difference and irreducibility for such a long time, then it was all of a sudden just like, oh, it's just, modern power. Like this is the kind of paradigm that we're working under. This is how we should understand it from that kind of lens. And so yeah, that's kind of inconsistency is what kind of made me curious to dig a little bit more into where he's coming from. And he's very big on Keynes, obviously. Mm-hmm. One of his main intellectual figures, and he's very big on this sociologist Bruno Latour, who you may be familiar with. And that's an interesting combination because Keynes is like he's like the main figurehead of like the 20th century progressive state, like the managerial state, like the ideology that technocrats, intelligent, technocratic experts know how the economy works and they can get it, they can track it in their models, they can fine-tune policy, fine-tune growth through policy to travel through an equilibrium and to basically reduce the possibility, if not get rid of it entirely, of like capitalist crisis. Mm-hmm. That was kind of like the classic Keynesian vision. I mean, Keynes himself even thought eventually we could get to like a kind of socialist-y society eventually that way, but that's a whole other big question. But Latour is like the opposite of that, right? Like Bruno Latour is like, look, if you're creating these big models of how society works and how the economy works, you're already like creating some kind of distorting, totalizing map that doesn't get at what the agents themselves are thinking, that doesn't capture what, the local agents, like local knowledge, local epistemology, the way that actors acting in ordinary and not ordinary contexts, the way that they think, and the way that they imagine things and the way that they talk about things. Like if you work with these big macro models in a kind of Keynesian way, right? Like you would be missing all of that subjective information. And Latour really kind of comes out of that. That's the whole premise behind his actor network theory, kind of paradigm that he was famous for pioneering. And so those are two like really opposite kind of figures. Like they are opposing figures in many ways, but they're both big influences for twos. But I thought it was just interesting that like, one is like the spokesperson for the 20th century managerial state, Keynes. The other is like one of its most influential critics, right? Of like that kind of state, seeing like a state logic, that like kind of all-encompassing statist epistemology in Latour. So kind of like a big critique of that Keynesian project. But they're both focused either speaking for or criticizing this state formation that is now on its way out. That like, I mean, the economists, no one gives a shit about economists anymore. The New York Times is like running newspaper articles about like economists can't get jobs because, policymakers don't care about them anymore because Trump and his people don't care about them anymore. They think they're all idiots.
I mean, for anyone who's like awake, economists have collectively kind of destroyed the world.
Yeah.
Multiple recurring financial crises.
They have no credibility. And the fact is, they're running the economy in a way that they think they don't need any of these fancy models and predictive formulas and exercises that like academic economists and policy economists typically are known for, and so were sought after for. And so we're sort of in this like quasi post economics moment in terms of national policy.
Yeah.
And that's because the state is, like I've been arguing, it's becoming this different kind of thing. It's becoming this monstrous, like border obsessed, repressive machine that is just like, to hell with that like fancy technocratic knowledge. Like we don't need that stuff anymore. Like we're just going to run this thing like a business. with a huge private security force. Or it's a public agency. ICE is a public agency. Border Patrol is a public agency, but they're running it almost like it's a private security agency, answering directly to the to certain people in the state. So that's where I'm coming from with that. They're both very really all three of them. I want to say, like Keynes, Latour, Tooze, they're operating within a paradigm that is like evaporating before our eyes.
They're all acting or thinking in reference to this idealized managerial state that is, I mean, it's at this point, it might as well be fantasy. The thing I'm struggling with, it's stretching from your piece. It's not what you addressed directly, but like how you talk about the economics profession and economists as in the state that they're trying to advise, and how that's all getting outmoded. There's something parallel to that happening in my discipline of international relations. Like IR scholars are not trusted, generally not viewed as relevant. They've, to the extent that they have mattered in the world, they've obviously shit the bed. I mean, all we do is make fucking predatory, horrific, bloodletting decisions in foreign policy, like, fucking, yeah. So like, I'm not totally sure what to do with that, but like international relations also feels like a dying kind of discipline. I actually wrote that recently, and its reference point is also famously the state. Like the nation state is in some paradigms like realism, it's the only relevant unit of analysis, the state. Yeah. But what that state is like in so many different ways, decaying, corroding, corrupting, reverting to primitive accumulation. I mean, like, there's some shit going on. I mean, and like, so there's a grand and narcissistic way in which I'm like sort of relating to your essay.
There's a broad crackdown on just like, fields of academic specialization to core, it's part of their broader kind of cultural war against what they see as excessively liberal institutions, which they think are like crawling with communists. And which, believe me, like I work at one, like it's not anything like that, like if only, right? But yeah, there's this like deep suspicion of specialized theoretical knowledge that comes out of this. I think it is downstream from the cultural war that they're waging on the traditional institutions of like liberal government and civil society, and it's just increasingly part of this society-wide attempt to, just uproot these institutions, which they see as like malign social forces, influences, like root and branch, and replace them, if they want to replace the people at all, with their, with right-thinking cronies. And I actually think they take a page out of Tayyip Erdogan's playbook, the Turkish president, on this. He's also been very successful in like kind of domesticating the more critical and sort of lefty aspects in the Turkish university system, and replacing it with like regime loyalists. Mm-hmm. And I think the Trump people, and that's over there too in that country, that's part of a broader kind of crackdown on civil society that's been happening for decades. But I think the Trump people are kind of canny about that, and they look around, they look at countries like Turkey, they look at like Hungary, right? They probably look at Russia. I mean, hell, they might even look at China. And they're taking lessons about, how to run things in a very autocratic and effective way, I think, from some of these other examples internationally. And so I think the attack on, like academic specialization is like very much part of that.
You talk about the bourgeois state, the managerial state, and you have this interesting like reorientation for how we should think about governments. And at one point you say, quote, where is it? their role is pacifying the workforce, preserving private property, and promoting the national and international special interests of the ruling class. End quote. So I've never quite put it that way, but I think that almost like new conceptualization of government it's terrible in its implications, but like it's totally compatible with what foreign policy people think they're doing. Like they never admit that something that they advocate for is a special interest of the ruling class. Like their whole job is to rationalize things as being in the national interest. So like that would go against what their function is. But like you can always trace back like winners and losers of any foreign policy action, any use of state power, of course. And if the system is working rationally, technocratically, then it should be benefiting the status quo, which is benefiting, those with power, those with wealth, those who rule. And that is partially what is like not working, or like collapsing. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the ideology of state power, right? Like, not so much like what do technocrats think or whatever, but like what are historical precedents that are making the technocrats idealize the state form, like it's the state fetish, the West Wing Aaron Sorkin, it's building an ideology around that is like butting up against reality right now. And like and that is, you didn't say this, to still believe in state power in an era where state power is basically just serving corrupt oligarchs and white nationalists, that is demobilizing. Like that the misplaced belief in state power makes you docile as opposed to agitated, I forgot what my question even was. Where do you
the ideological conception of state power, right?
Where does
it come from? No, totally. I mean, so I come out of the sort of broadly what I would call the Marxian tradition of state theory, right? And I have different sort of writers I'm thinking, or I draw on for this, but the basic idea that like the kind of basic like liberal conception of the state, kind of like what you were alluding to in your comments about that maybe some academics share, is like, and this goes back to the post-war era, especially. There's this conception that there's not just one ruling class. There's a plurality of different interests, and the national state exists apart from those interests. And through the democratic process or whatever, legitimation is generated for the government, the governing class. Policymakers are able to kind of bridge the democratic voting public with the interests of big business and kind of forge a compromise between them, right? And that's like good government. The sort of critical theory of the state is calling that out and basically saying, this idea, it's not just that the ruling class is just directly controlling the state. Like you see sometimes, people like reducing, like a vulgar Marxist idea that the state is purely just the committee for the bourgeoisie, executive committee for the bourgeoisie or whatever. It's not that, but it's also not that the state is entirely autonomous and able to act apart from all of these different interests. It's that the very appearance of the state as a neutral institution, as an impartial, judge between these different social like conflicts that stands above them, is itself a necessary feature of capitalist rule, because there's no way that you can govern a economic system so prone to breakdown and prone to class conflict and social war, and with conflict built right into the economic process itself, right? Like directly in the class system, without some kind of like powerful set of institutions to not affect this like false compromise between these different interests, but to regulate the class war forcibly if necessary, right? And if you look at history, I mean, that's a large part of what the state does. It intervenes, not entirely, but mostly on the side of capital. And when it does intervene on the side of like organized labor, for example, it is with a longer term view of the best interests of the capitalist class, right? Like in the 30s, it's like, look, Rosa FDR is like, if we don't get our shit together on this, we're going to have something a lot worse than like sit down strikes in Flint, Michigan and Toledo, Ohio. I mean, it's going to, there's a revolutionary possibility here that we have to get ahead of, just as an example. And so that is kind of what I feel, that's what I argue in the piece is like the historical basis of the progressive managerial state is that tendency of the capitalist society to need a form of political rule that can be separate enough from the different interests of the capitalist class that it can try to organize them, and it can try to kind of forge alliances and compromises between them in a way that will allow, keep class conflict relatively muted and allow growth, which is to say profits, to continue to go up. And what has been the kind of evolution of that, which is the kind of second half of the essay, is how this process of autonomization is leading to its own unraveling, because the more that the more that the private economy sort of decays and slows down, and the more that, like, for instance, the American economy becomes less and less able to generate broad economic growth for most of the population, the more the state itself the national state has to get involved directly in managing different parts of the what was the private economy, right? And you see this in the financial system with the kind of like, the need to bail out like any possibility of a crisis. They're willing to basically bail out anything instead of allowing the economy to crash. Now Trump and company are taking direct stakes in different companies. Like you've probably seen, they bought a big share in a rare earths company. The government, that is to say, I think it was the Department of Defense itself, bought a share in the only American rare earths mining company that we have. And I think they also bought a large share, or maybe the Treasury, bought a large share in Intel, the chip maker, which is kind of like the failing other chip company besides NVIDIA, which, received all these subsidies during the Biden years, but can't do shit because they're just a failure, basically. And then we could go back to the Biden administration and talk about how all the stuff they were trying to do to revive industrial policy, right, was like this new intervention of the state in the national economy. And so all these interventions in the economy have the gradual effect of kind of removing the competitive dynamism from the private American economy, because it's just the state is now, like bailing out any financial institution, any bank, any shadow bank if it, runs into trouble. It's constantly trying to decrease corporate taxes even more than they already were. It's creating new subsidies for private corporations, creating new windfall opportunities for profits for like fossil fuel companies, for the tech companies, for the stupid AI boom, funding a lot of that through the defense budget. The sort of like beating heart of the competitive capitalist economy is being stamped out. And it's because of this exact dynamic of the growing autonomization, what I call in the essay, the autonomy of the state, and its ability to intervene in the private economy in order to protect it, right, and to prevent economic breakdown and capitalist crisis. But by that very emergency kind of policy process, it's pulling the heart out of the private competitive economy, if that makes sense, because of all these policy guarantees and subsidies and all the rest of it. So it's a paradoxical sort of trajectory that I'm trying to track.
Yeah, I mean, this is why it's important to recognize that the state does not function as a neutral actor, even if it's important to be seen that way, because if it's not a neutral actor, then when it intervenes in the economy, it's not doing so neutrally.
Mm-hmm.
I think the libertarian thing would be like, it's picking winners and losers, and how can you do that? That's not the problem. It's that it uses state power to the benefit of shaky, shitty, unsustainable, uncompetitive firms that the capitalist system has become too reliant on. And so it props, it's like anti-capitalist logic in a way. Like it props up these firms that would get cannibalized otherwise. And in doing that, they literally are basically saying like, and nobody else matters, end of story. Right? Like if you're doing that with state power, you're not tending after the welfare state. You're not trying to redistribute power between in the balance of forces between capital and labor. Like you're not using the state power on behalf of a common good. You're using state power on behalf of propping up a crisis prone system. And it's you're picking winners and losers within for that end. And it's like, what good is that? And is that what fucking Keynes imagined? You know what I mean? Is that what progressive managerial state is supposed to be?
Right.
I think
yeah. It's not. And I mean, I guess just one way to kind of like sum up the idea is like, the managerial state looked out for the general interest of the capitalist class, right? Like you have this class that, is constantly at war with itself. Like they're all out, every corporation is for the most part out for themselves. And none of them are interested in like the general health of like the system as a whole, right? And like that was the point of the 20th century state, was like it was going to take the system as a whole into its purview and look out for it. And excuse me. And now it's not clear they're certainly not interested in that project anymore. And even if they are interested, it's not clear if they'd even be able to, because like they're now, I mean, the actual infrastructure of the state agencies themselves is being dismantled and destroyed so rapidly that it's like, it's not clear that the technocrats are even going to be able to, revive that classical mission of the capitalist state to look out for the interests of the whole system. And so, I really think that idea, that conception of what state power is sort of over.
Man, it's bleak. Yeah, and like it's hard to think about the existing political system going in a more productive direction. Even like 2020, 2028, we can just fix this shit. Because the Democratic Party, I think you say this, like the Democratic Party has become the party of BlackRock, like financial capital. So like there is no like normal to revert back to at this point. And I talk to a lot of policymakers overseas, obviously, because of where I am. And it's very common for sort of liberal leaning, which is the dominant mode, diplomats and government people in different countries in the global north. It's very common for them to be like, we just got to ride out the Trump administration. We just wait till 2028. We'll get Biden 2.0, which is, probably Buttigieg or somebody. And then like, they'll be able to like pantomime normalcy again. And we can just live in that normalcy and fucking vibe out with it. And it's like, we can all kind of like pretend we're continuing in some version of the unipolar moment, basically, like Obama never died, that kind of shit. That is so profound. That's where I feel like you're making an intervention, because it's like, if that's what you think, you're so out to lunch. You're on fucking Mars. You know what I mean? Like you are not relating to reality. You have no account for why any of this stuff is happening. And we're all gonna die ultimately because of that, like. Take it further.
I cannot believe that there are still like, policy elites in other in other countries, like who really believe that like we can just go back to some kind of normal after this. Like I mean, I get where they're coming from, and there is a kind of there is a capitalist constituency like that you mentioned, like BlackRock, like the big sort of asset managers, like who is waiting for they want some kind of return to the status quo, quote unquote, because they don't like all the instability and all the unpredictability of the Trump years. But like this country is just it's coming apart. You know, like the people are it's not just the maniacs at the top. It's like civil society is coming apart. Like people are, I mean, every day that there's I mean, the shooting, like random stochastic violence has always been bad in this country, you know, but like, I mean, just the random shootings and assassination attempts and just like crazed gun acts are just getting more and more frequent, you know, by the week. And it's just like, we are a deeply unwell society from root to branch right now. And that reflects the overall trajectory of the country, which is into this, you know, much for all the reasons we've been talking about in this interview, like this much darker, like national, like super nationalistic direction. That is, it's going to be, it's very difficult to imagine how just like a Buttigieg or whoever the Democrats settle on for 2028 can just hit the reverse switch on this, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a sickening feedback loop between the corrosive, you know, poisoning of society in the form of all these shootings and militias and the insanity with the maniacs at the top. You know, like the maniacs at the top are in a way like their existence is like a morbid symptom of a broken society, you know?
Yes. Yes.
You had this great statement, and it's like if you're looking at the world from the normal orientation or the conventional wisdom orientation, you might pick up pieces of what we're talking about here and then not be able to relate it back to how you see the world. But you have this intervention. You say private enterprise is unable to sustain itself without intensifying state intervention, and national governments are helpless without an endless well of privately financed debt. As capitalist institutions extinguish themselves, so goes the basis of their official ideology, liberalism. And that is something that everybody in the conventional wisdom mode sees and fears and is oriented toward and recognizes is in decline and on the back foot. And it's like, oh, this might actually be an account for it. The declining rate of profit, crisis of capital accumulation, state intervention to prop up the recurring crises of capital accumulation. And in state intervening in that way, liberal institutions and values are no longer convenient because it becomes more about power and who gets to have the power and who gets to benefit from it. Well, the people who already have it and have those relationships, and that starts to look a lot like corruption or rule by the wealthy, and we might call that a fucking oligarchy. Or if you're Mussolini, you say, you know, fascism is the marriage of corporations and the state. You know what I mean? And like, and here, yada, 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 here we are, you know?
And here we are, yeah.
And so there ain't no liberalism's in decay because of this larger process. And so like liberalism is not the solution, obviously. It's not something to get back to.
At least without some kind of critical reconstruction, renovation of the liberal project, sort of like what Keynes did and his people, right? Like that was another time of great peril for liberalism as a project, as a governing philosophy of capitalist civilization. It's not that their ideology fixed the problems of the global economic order, but they sort of gave it a name. They figured out how to like push against some of the old prejudices of what liberal government was in order to articulate this new idea for what it could be, you know? And there's just no indication that like there's any intellectual heft for that among any of the liberal institutions these days, even in the academy. You know,
Dude,
it's just not there.
Yes. I mean, so first of all, that's a very smart way to think about Keynes. It's not that we should be doing Keynesianism per se. It's not that, like, okay, government stimulus is our way out of fascism. That's too copy and paste. But the idea of, like, Keynes develops Keynesian, prescriptions in response to the crisis of his conjuncture. Now is a moment where we need Keynes types to develop their prescriptions in response to our conjuncture. That's the parallel. That's smart. The aside, or not an aside, but like one build on thing that or like an amplification of what you just said. I saw the other day, Larry Summers, fuckhead. I don't even know how to describe him anymore.
Yeah.
Former Treasury Secretary under Clinton.
Fucking awful man.
Evil human being. Yeah. He was assigning to Harvard students some Substack posts from Noah Smith. And and I kind of quipped that, like, the ruling class was in shitifying itself, you know?
It absolutely is.
And I was just kind of trolling, but like I've been thinking about that ever since because it was so absurd. Like Harvard, Noah Smith, Substack, like what the fuck are we doing here? You know?
Yeah.
But it's like,
you're in trouble when you're looking to Noah Smith to get you through the woods. Yeah.
Like there are probably a lot of examples about that. And like it that dovetails with the final sentence of your essay. I can't remember what you said exactly, but like it's like capitalism is failing to even produce competent managers for itself, to get back to your point about Keynes, you know?
Yeah. There's a real intellectual epistemological crisis going on here that has to do with this longer term historical process of breakdown that we've been discussing this whole time. And for whatever reason, just these Keynes-like figures are not emerging to, like, and maybe that's just, that can be a result of many different factors, like not least of which could be the totally different media environment that we live in now, right? Where information is consumed completely differently and has been hopelessly debased by AI slop, the age of slop and initiatification. But for whatever reason, these Keynes-like figures, if we want to call them that, who have like a vision for the renovation of liberalism as a project, are not emerging, right? The best we get is just like every year a new third wayist think tank emerges that comes up with the brilliant idea that, surprise, like we have to exclude the left.
That's AstroTurf shit too, yeah.
Oh, always. There's never any popular basis for any of this stuff. The Abundance Project, you're probably familiar with this, right? As Fine, his book, Derek Thompson. That's their latest attempt to kind of like articulate a third wayist solution in the language of abundance. But like, again, there's no popular constituency for it. Like, so it's just building castles in the air and trying to get like enough kind of like media and academic and policy elites behind it. But
also they're not reasonable these AstroTurf abundance type shits are not reasonable responses to the problems of our moment. I mean, like, they're fucking so mismatched, and that's probably part of why they have to be AstroTurfed. I mean, like, who's gonna rally behind fucking nonsense? Deregulation in response to all the shit going on? Are you kidding? Like,
yeah, exactly. It's not gonna It's not politics,
It's not That's a good way to put it.
It's not politics. So that's where we're at with the liberal intelligentsia. It's not looking good. But to get back to your question, like, I mean, that it has happened before, right? Like liberalism as a philosophy has undergone these periods of renewal, but it doesn't look like that's in the offing, at least as of this point. And so I think and this is what I hope to write about more in the future. Like, I've been writing about political economy for 7 or 8 years now. And I'm ready to just start getting into politics and political theory and what this moment really politically calls for, right? Or what kind of politics would be adequate to it. Yeah, hopefully more to come on that.
international relations is very like technocratic theorizing, and in fact, the field doesn't have a ton of theorizing is not rewarded professionally in IR. It's like theory testing basically through statistical methods and survey experiments. That's kind of what's rewarded, which is the most sort of like, I don't know how to small dick energy. Like it's like the most like unambitious, like
because it's just copying economics.
Yeah, yes.
And so methodologically.
That comes, like I said, IR is going through the same problems as the economics discipline. IR is derivative of the economics discipline. So like that kind of makes sense. That tracks. Yeah. Man. Yeah. But I find that's how I was sort of trained. But in the past few years, and I think this is what resonates among many things with your essay, is like grand theorizing is like so desperately needed. Political theory is something that everybody should be more invested in. I find myself also gravitating back to it because everything that we've been fed up to this point intellectually leaves us unable to come up with good diagnoses for what's going on. And if you don't have that, how can you fucking act and mobilize and everything else,
Exactly.
Well, fascinating, profound, super fucking bleak.
I mean, I'm not a pessimist actually.
Tell me more.
I mean, I think that there's, I'm based in Chicago, and so I'm going off a limited sample set, but my sense is there's just a lot of disgust with not just with the maniacs in power, but with the available alternatives. And there's a huge hunger for something else. And that doesn't necessarily entail working in the mainstream political institutions.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very powerful sense of urgency that normies, not people who we would say are inclined to identify with the left normally, are feeling around this moment. Like I would hazard to say that like there is a growing sense that things are not going to be going back to normal, and like the liberal leadership, the Democrats, are not going to get us out of this, and we're going to have to do it ourselves. It still remains to be seen how that is going to take shape, but we also see stuff like Zoran Mamdani's election in New York. Very cool. What he's going to be able to do practically is a different question, but it shows you that there are these very powerful yearnings and attitudes and feelings that people have for something different, right? And I think it's incumbent on us to work to enter that and to work within that milieu, and to join with our fellow workers and articulate that alternative to the status quo politics, because that shit's going nowhere.
Frankly. Yeah. Well, that's very positive. Yeah. Emanuel Wallerstein, like in the early days of the Iraq War, so 20 something years ago, he had written that at that point we were in the early stages of a 50-year terminal crisis of capitalism. And I don't know how terminal the crisis is. Politicians seem to figure out solutions, patchwork solutions. Mm-hmm. But the idea that we were in a sort of long durée of crisis was really interesting. And the key insight he had there was that, like, if this is true, then we are in an era where truly, like, anything is possible. And whatever you do to take action within this historical period, there are periods where your actions don't matter. It's just true. And he's like, that's not the era that we're entering in. He's like, the era that we're entering in now, what everybody does has consequences and stakes. And so the source of optimism is that, like, actually anything is possible again. And he's like, odds are it's going to be barbarous and horrific, but it doesn't have to be. It could go a different way, man. And that's the sign of hope.
No, yes, 100% sign on with Wallerstein on that.
All right. Well, this has been super generative. Thanks for coming on and talking through this. The piece is called, I don't think I introduced the piece up front. It's called The Suicide State at the Brooklyn Rail, which is kind of a fascinating publication, actually. Like, a lot of what they publish is not of this sort of critical analysis stuff. Like, they do a lot of stuff in like the arts and other stuff, but the analytical stuff is great. Jamie Marchant.
The field notes section of the Brooklyn Rail is where you'll find this kind of analysis. Yeah,
that's right. Field notes section. All right. I'll link to the show notes, this piece, and to your book. Thanks for coming on, man. This was awesome.
Likewise, it was absolutely a pleasure, and happy to do it again sometime.
All right. Yeah, we'll have you back. Thanks, man. Take care.
All right. Take care.
Bye. Peace.